I'm Darren Samuelsohn, Insider's DC Bureau Chief. I'm at the White House. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been interviewing the descendants and relatives of 5 former American presidents for Red, White, and Gray. Insider's deep dive into America's gerontocracy and how we got here, what are the costs, and what are the benefits of having so many aged leaders in our country. I interviewed Jim Drury, a descendant of President John Tyler, the 10th president of the United States. I interviewed Tweed Roosevelt, a descendant of President Teddy Roosevelt. I interviewed Patricia Taft, great-granddaughter of President William H. Taft. I interviewed Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the niece of President John F. Kennedy. And I interviewed Jason Carter, the grandson of President Jimmy Carter. The descendants of the presidents saw a lot of wisdom in electing a president who's in their 40s, their 50s, or their 60s. They bring some energy, some youth, some thinking about their future legacy.
I think my grandfather was ahead of his time in a lot of ways, right? I mean, you're talking about essentially, as I've said before, the first millennial president. I mean, he was for hardcore on climate change, hardcore on alternative energy, criminal justice reform, legalizing pot. He conserved more land than any other president ever. I mean, if you put that on the ballot now, you know, it would make Beto O'Rourke blush.
William Howard Taft really was a president that he didn't necessarily focus on younger generations, but he did focus on the preservation of this country and how we could expand it.
I mean, he thought of himself as a vigorous person, you know, the strenuous life and all that. And that's the way he approached things. And clearly, his young age for being president allowed him to be much more vigorous as a president than perhaps some of the older ones.
I think he did care that it was going to be a successful country in the future, but I suspect that a man in the early 19th century wouldn't have any idea what would have become of this country now, with it being the world's major superpower and that sort of thing.
In the inauguration, he said the torch has been passed to a new generation, born in war, tempered by peace. So he was calling to a group of young people who had not had power. It is time for you to take power and to use it well and to make the world better. That was his message. It was a message of, it is our time to make the difference. We have the qualities, we have the experience, we have the energy.
Do you think that the age of our leaders currently in America is a problem, or is it an asset for American democracy?
Diversity of any kind is great. I think that obviously you don't want all of our leaders to be of like a single generation. We don't want everyone to be millennials. We don't want everyone to be baby boomers. We don't want everyone to be like Gen Xers. I think we needed a thread to be woven.
I think that younger generations just have a different lens on the present. And so they look at the problems, they see the problems, they understand the problems in a different way. And I honestly think the answer to all of this is you can't have just old people and you can't have just young people. You've got to have people as members of a team, in essence, that are going to look at this, give their perspectives. You get the benefit of the experience.
Joe Biden's benefited from years of experience, and the experience is certainly beneficial. The prior president didn't have, even though he was older, he didn't have any experience, and I think that probably hurt him. Barack Obama, for example, was a young man with relatively little experience on the national scene, and I think it probably hurt him a little bit in terms of establishing a better relationship with Congress.
What happens sometimes when we have older presidents, I think they sort of want to revert back to a time that maybe never even existed in terms of like cutting back, like expansion and like in terms of technology and growth. Not always, but sometimes. I think it's important to distinguish youth from experience. And this is a generation that had, especially with my uncle, had fought in World War II and whose father had been the ambassador, so he had traveled throughout the world. So you could say he's young, but he has had probably much more experience than even some of our older presidents because of the family that he was born into on one hand and at the time that he was born into.
Do you think that every generation does deserve a president, and that it's time for indeed someone from not the baby boomers, but the next generation to come in?
The voters kind of decide that. They might pick some, like a lot of young people, like Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is older than President Biden. And it's just a lot depends on what the person is saying, how they're saying it, what they're talking about, what their priorities are.
Poor Gen Xers, I feel like they have like a bad rap because they're like, oh, everyone, I mean, Gen X, right? People call them lazy. They're not necessarily not all these things I remember like in the 90s. The thing is, like millennials, they say we're like entitled, but I also think we're like pretty thirsty, right? Like we're ready to just like take the reins. I think that there is a pro to trophy culture, that we all got trophies for participation, because I feel like there's a confidence there that you can go in and jump in and still change things.
Do you think that age is a problem for Democrats?
Nancy Pelosi, as I said, is the best speaker I think we've ever had. So clearly, no. I think all those people who are working with Nancy Pelosi are so lucky that they get to see somebody with her smarts and cleverness in action.
We have tons of young, exciting, dynamic people. Like certainly, I would say more so than the Republican Party. We have this incredibly diverse bench full of young people from all different kinds of backgrounds.
In an era like this where people feel their lives are at risk, what, again, advice do you give to young people who if they're going to step out and put their necks out?
So this idea that politics is now more vicious today than it was in 1789 or 90 is completely wrong. It is true, it's maybe more present, but we have lived with viciousness for a long period of time. It's part of America. I'm not saying that proudly, but that's what I'm saying. Develop a code, get strong. I mean, I'm telling you, I grew up, my father was called ruthless when he was prosecuting the mob. The mob threatened to throw acid in my eyes, so I couldn't leave school like other kids did. So, I understand, and because of my personal experience, that if you want to make a difference, it's tough. And that's just life.